Okay, welcome to the very first Travels with a Dilettante. I am the dilettante, Moscow. I am a dilettante for lots of reasons. I'm particularly a dilettante for this talk because I am not an expert about anything that I'll be telling you about either tonight or any of the other nights. What I am is an interested observer. I have a deep interest in Russian culture. I have had it my entire life. And I've lived here. I've lived in Moscow now for 28 years. And in all my time here, I've written 11 books of one kind or another, all of them connected with Russian theater. And a couple of years ago, I began walking out around the city with my camera. This is my camera right here. This is it. And taking pictures of statues, memorial plaques on walls. Sometimes I would do research and I would find something interesting about a building that nobody else seemed to know. I mean, somebody knows it, or otherwise I wouldn't have been able to research it. But there was no plaques, no sign, no statues, no nothing saying that something interesting had happened there. And so I started taking pictures of buildings like that too. And at a certain point, I began to think, what am I going to do with all these pictures that I'm taking? And a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, I guess, I started a blog. And I mean, what else do you do this day and age? You start a blog. Everybody tells me that I should turn it into a book, and I am not going to turn it into a book because it's not a book, it's a blog. When you write a book, you have to answer for what you say. When you write a blog, you can just sit down and hammer something out and just let it go and forget about it, you know, and if there's a mistake in there, somebody writes you a letter and says, hey, you got that wrong, and you say, thank you very much, I appreciate that, and you correct it. I'm not going to write this. None of this stuff will ever turn into a book. It will always be a blog. It's a blog I really love. Today, we are beginning with a building which is right next to this theater. It's 25 Tverskaya Ulitsa. And there's a good reason that you're seeing photographs run of this building. I just pulled together all of my photos, and I just threw them all on here, and I'm just going to let them run. And maybe every once in a while I'll stop and talk about something specific. But there's a real good reason why I want to talk about this building. Not only because it's the next building over from the Stanislavski Electrotheater, which is where we are all located. I should also say, in the event that you don't know this, this is being broadcast around the world on a live stream by HowlRound TV. And so welcome to HowlRound and all of you people who are watching on HowlRound. There were 57 people signed up to come tonight, and it's rainy today, so not all 57 made it here, but we're here. And we're here at the Stanislavski Electrotheater for one of the evenings evenings go on here at the Stanislavski Electrotheater almost every single night. Lectures, talks, concerts, obviously shows. Tonight, it's me talking about a building at 25 Tverskaya Street. And as I began to say, I have a particular interest in this building. Because in this building, for about 3 years, at least 3 years, I don't know exactly how many years, but I know it was approximately 3 years, and it probably wasn't much more than 3 years. One of the people that lived there was the guy that I wrote my very first book about. His name is Nikolае Erdman. Nikolае Erdman if you don't know it, was a great Soviet Russian writer. Nikolае Erdman, actually you know much more about Nikolае Erdman than you think you do, because most of you young people who grew up watching cartoons, almost all of the best cartoons you watched were written by Nikolае Erdman. He wrote the scripts. He was one of the best scriptwriters for cartoons. He also wrote the script to Jolly Fellows, Veselые Ребята. It's a film you know as Veselые Ребята. Good evening, hello, welcome. He wrote the script to Volga Volga. These are all films that we all watch 3 times a month on television. They still run today. They were, Jolly Fellows was made in 1933. Actually, 1934 it came out, 34, and it still runs today on television all the time. It's a cult favorite. It's had films made imitating it and imitations of imitations. It's one of those films that is part of the Russian culture. That was written by Nikolai Erdman, the guy that lived here for several years next door. But the reason that Nikolai Erdman, the reason I wrote a book about Nikolai Erdman is because he is one of the greatest playwrights of the last century. He had a difficult life. He only wrote 2 major plays. He wrote one play that Vsevolod Meyerhold staged in 1925 called The Mandate in English, or The Warrant. And it was a monstrous success. It was the most popular, the most influential new play written in the Soviet Union since the Soviet Union came into being. And its influence on Soviet literature, and particularly Soviet theater and Soviet drama, was enormous. And Vsevolod Meyerhold, who staged it, wanted to get another play from this guy, and so he immediately commissioned another play. This play that he immediately commissioned in 1925, shortly within months after the premiere of The Warrant, this play entered into one of the most difficult fates one could imagine a play could fall into. Because Erdman, as this country changed, the country was becoming much more difficult to live in. Stalin was slowly taking power in the last half of the 20s. There was less and less freedom. There was more and more concern of censorship. Lots and lots and lots of people were leaving the country. Nikolai Erdman actually considered leaving at one point. His father was a Baltic German, and so Erdman could easily have gone to Lithuania or Latvia or someplace like that. He could easily have gotten out, and he considered doing so, but decided not to in the end. And in any case, he signed the contract to write this next play in the summer of 1925. The first time that a draft came around was 1928. That's 3 years later. And that's a long time for a play to gestate. It's a very long time. It's very hard. Plays, usually writers like to write plays very quickly. Most of the playwrights I know, and I know a lot of them, they usually close all their doors, close all their windows, turn off all their telephones, or they go out to a dacha with no electricity or anything. Well, electricity, they have computer, but no telephones or anything. And they sit down in the course of a couple of weeks, maybe a month, they write a play. The fact that it took Erdman 3 years to come up with his first draft was a sign of how difficult this play was. And the play, as it turned out, was a play about a young man who is out of work and has no place in the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Union. There is no place for him. And this became very controversial. The play was not even finished. It was not staged. But there had been a few readings of it around, and those readings were being attacked in the press. Erdman was being labeled as an anti-revolutionary and anti-Soviet, and the play wasn't even done yet. I mean, it was still being created. This hung on for another 4 years until 1932, when Erdman finally came up with a version that the Moscow Art Theater wanted to stage, and Meyerhold wanted to stage at his theater. And they both rehearsed it, but neither one of the theaters could bring the play to fruition. It was banned. Lazar Kaganovich, who was one of Stalin's right-hand men, came to a nighttime showing at Meyerhold's theater to pass judgment on the play, and what he saw did not please him. And he went back to Stalin that night and said, "You don't want that play to come to fruition." So the suicide, which Erdman, on the peak of success, 1925, huge success with The Mandate, The Warrant, signs a contract with Meyerhold to write another play. This play finally straggles to a dress rehearsal 7 years later in his band. A year later, Erdman is arrested. He was in the town of Gagre, down on the Black Sea, and he was there with his co-writer, a friend of his by the name of Vladimir Mas, and they were writing the script together. They were doing the script for Veselые ребята, for Jolly Fellows, this film that I talked about right at the very beginning. And they were arrested, Mas and Erdman were both arrested right there on the set of the film and taken away. People were absolutely stunned. There's actually, Erdman's father was there, and if you know the film Jolly Fellows, if you've seen it, you've probably seen it 100 times, but if you remember back, there's an old man in the film, particularly in the early third half of the film. There's an old man who comes in and out of the scenes from time to time. That is Nikolae Erdman's father. He was a very colorful guy. Everybody loved his accent. He had this very thick German accent. And so all the people in film, actually, Boris Barnet, another filmmaker, also filmed Erdman's father in one of his films. So actually, Nikolae Erdman's father, Robert Erdman, was in at least 2 or 3 major Soviet films with fairly large roles. Anyway, the reason I started talking about him is because there's a fascinating thing that happens with his letters back home. He writes to his very touching letters back to his wife, back to Moscow. Every day he writes back, and he talks about his son Kolya all the time. Kolya this, Kolya that. Kolya came over today for coffee. Kolya was doing this and that and the other thing. Kolya went out to sunbathe with Volodya Vladimir Mas. Every single day he writes a letter back home, Kolya this, Kolya that. And on the night of the 10th of October, 1933, letter home, he writes, Kolya went out with somebody today in a big car, and he hasn't come back yet. I'm sure he'll be back soon. And for 10 days after that, all of the letters home say nothing about Kolya. And the reason is because by that time, that night, when he was taken away in that car that his father saw him go drive away in, he was arrested. And they sent him back to Moscow, to Lubyanka. He spent 3 or 4 nights in Lubyanka, in the basement of Lubyanka, and was kept separate from Vladimir Mas, of course, so that they couldn't talk to each other. And they were both sent into exile within 3 days. Boom, and he was out of there. 4 days ago, he was in Gagri making Jolly Fellows, one of the first great Soviet musical comedies. And within 4 days, he was on a train heading to Siberia as an exile. That's where he was, as those of us who talk about Erdman and talk about those times, that is what we call the incredibly lucky stroke that Erdman had. The fact that he was arrested in 1933 and not in 1937. If he had been arrested in 1937, chances are extremely good that he would have joined Mandelstam and Kluyev and Meyerhold and all the others who were murdered, who were killed in the camps or in the Lubyanka. Erdman was fortunate enough, if we can put it that way, and I think we can, was fortunate enough to be arrested 3 years before the purges really got going. So he was outside of Moscow. He was in exile. He was in Siberia, a long way away. I don't want to turn this into a completely an Erdman talk, but I wanted to say all of this because I find it fascinating, and I think it's important when we talk about the building next door here at 25 Tverskaya Street, that in this building where there was all of these incredibly famous people that have lived there, the building was built in 1950. I'll talk about the history of the building in a minute. But Maya Plisetskaya lived there. Alexander Deneka, the artist, lived there. Several conductors of the Bolshoi Theater lived there. Sergei Lemeshev, whose plaque you can see behind me right now, one of the great singers in all of the Soviet history, he lived there, and on and on and on. Choreographers, dancers, lots of people from the Bolshoi Theater lived there. And the fact that Erdman lived there could strike one as being rather strange. How did Erdman, who was an exile, really had no fame anymore because the fame of his first play was long gone by this time. And as a screenwriter, his name was usually taken out of the credits. So when anybody who watched Jolly Fellows, after it came out in 1934, anybody who watched that film after when Erdman was arrested, until the early 1990s, Erdman's name was not in the credits. Erdman's name was not in the credits of Volga Volga. Another one of, actually Volga Volga was Joseph Stalin's favorite film. Joseph Stalin used to get up in the middle of the night or before going to bed in the early morning. He would call in the guy who showed him films, and he would watch Volga Volga. He watched it dozens and dozens of times. That's another fascinating story, and it actually touches this building right here. You can see it behind me again, this kind of flesh-colored building behind me. I'll talk more about that too, because there is a small connection. So how did Erdman get into this building? Well, let's figure out first of all how the building got here, because at the time when Erdman was in his beginning part of his career, when he was writing his plays and then writing those first film scripts, there was no such building here. There was an eye hospital on that spot at 25 Tverskaya Street. There was an eye hospital. All of you people now, you know that you're saying, wait a minute, he's got that wrong. The eye hospital is just down Mamonovsky Pereulok, just a little bit further. Well, you're right that the eye hospital is down there now, but that happened, it was moved. Stalin had that eye hospital, which was an old estate built in 1773. It used to stand on Tverskaya Street. And in the early 30s, between 33 and 36, when Stalin widened Tverskaya Street, he put that whole hospital on rollers, rolled it 50 meters back down the street, down Mamonovsky Pereulok, and not only did he do that, but he turned the building around to face the street it was now standing on. So there was this pretty incredible architectural engineering feat to move the old eye hospital off of Tverskaya Street and leave a great big hole. And they started building an apartment building. Just down the street, a little further down Tverskaya, or up Tverskaya, I should say, a little up Tverskaya Street, there used to be a church, which was destroyed in 1929. And on the place of that church, it was the church, it's called the Church of the Assumption. In place of that church, an apartment building was erected in the early 30s. And the plan was to continue building the apartment building all the way down here to what we now call Mamonovsky Pereulok, which is right here up against the wall of this theater. But what happened was that the construction was delayed, and they only got the first half of the building built. Actually, it's about 2/3 of the building. In fact, let me stop that baby right there. And you can see here, let me show you, the third of the building. That third of the building was put in where the church used to be. That's where the Church of the Assumption had originally been located. And then this part, that's the part that was not built in time. And when World War II started, it was left. Just left a hole. There was just a great big gaping hole there. And so it was not until 1949 that, after the war, that they finally got around to building the rest of this building. They brought back in the same architect, Andrei Burov. Andrei Burov had designed this building originally, and he designed that first half. And he came back in 1949 and designed the connection of this last third. And if you can see here, the 3 arches, and he put those 3 arches to connect the old part that was built in the 1930s and the newer part, which was built in 1949. And so that is how this building that we now see when we walk up and down Tverskaya Street, that's where that building came from. 2/3 of it was built in the 1930s in place of a church that had been destroyed, and the other third was built in 1949 to replace an eye hospital that had been pushed down the street on Mamonovsky Pereulok, about 50 meters. And for those who don't know, and for people who are maybe listening in HowlRound, I should point out that this was not the only case by any stretch of the imagination of buildings being moved in order to widen Tverskaya Street. Stalin wanted to widen the entire street. It used to be a fairly narrow, kind of cozy kind of street with churches sticking out into it and buildings sticking out into it. And he wanted to turn it into a more imperial kind of street, the main street that goes down to and away from the Kremlin. And so he had almost all of the buildings on this part of Tverskaya rolled back. This theater that we're located in, the Stanislavski Electrotheater, was also pushed back 30 or 40 meters. And in fact, I've seen them downstairs. The rails that this building was, believe it or not, this building, like the eye hospital, was put on rails and rolled back, and those rails are still down in the basement of this theater. That's kind of cool, actually. I don't know about the rails at 25 Tverskaya Street. So that's how the building came into being. The next thing about the building is that it was being built for the people who work at the Bolshoi Theater. It was a Bolshoi Theater co-op. It was a cooperative. And anybody in the entertainment business who was a really famous person had an opportunity to get in and be one of those who would receive these elite apartments. This is why when you look at the memorial plaques on the building, they all say this person lived here from 1950 until, and then you can pretty much figure out when their death date is because most of them lived here until they died. So somebody was here from 1950 until 1964 or until 1977 or until 1969, whenever it was when they died. Now I come back to the original question, is how does Erdman, who is this guy who was in exile, is not by any stretch of the imagination a famous person in the Soviet Union at this point, how does he get into this place? Well, the fact of the matter is that his wife, his girlfriend at the time, was a ballerina at the Bolshoi Theater. Erdman had 3 wives. They were all dancers. Erdman liked dancers. And his first wife was a variety show dancer that worked at the Variety Theater. His second wife, Natalia Chidsin, with whom he lived here for several years, was a dancer at the Bolshoi, and his third wife was also a dancer. They had become involved with one another in the early 40s, Erdman and Natalia Chidsin. Her father was British, which is why her name is Chidsin. It's not a Russian name. They had just kind of been together for almost a decade when they finally decided in 1950 to get married. I don't know whether they decided to get married because it was clear she was going to get an apartment and it seemed like a good time to get married. I have no idea. I never met Erdman. Erdman died in 1970, so it's not possible. It was not possible for me to talk to him, but I did meet Natalia Chidsin, and I spent some time in her apartment here in this building. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But they were married in 1950, and they moved into this building like everybody else who moved into this building in 1950. Everybody moved in 1950. It's rather interesting that within months of his moving in here, one of his most famous films came out. So he wouldn't have written the script while living here. But while he was living here, a film called Courageous People was released in September of 1950. By this time, he would already have been in the building. And for this film, a year later, he was awarded a Stalin Prize, second degree. So here's where I come back to Stalin a little bit. because everybody who was connected to this film, Courageous People, said that it was essentially a request from Stalin that this film be made. Stalin wanted this film made about heroic people out in the steppes during the war. He wanted it to be made a very kind of human kind of story, not the regular heroic story with lots of bombs blowing up and everything, but with a bit of humor and a bit of human touch to the whole thing. And if you'll remember, one of Stalin's most beloved films, his favorite film, Volga Volga, was written by Nikolai Erdman. He knew that Erdman would do a good job on this kind of a film, and so the word was put out. It was not a direct request, but it was understood at Mosfilm. Everybody that knew about the film knew this at the time. It was understood that Stalin wanted Erdman to write the script for Courageous People. It is also understood, everybody kind of had the sense that this was going, if this worked, it would be really good for everybody involved. Meaning, this is the kind of film for which someone might receive an award. And indeed, that did happen. Erdman and his co-author, he wrote the script with another guy by the name of Mikhail Volpin. Both of them were awarded Stalin Prizes second class, not first class, but second class. But it's an important thing because this clearly was a case of Stalin saying to Erdman, okay, you're forgiven now. You haven't stuck your neck out since you were arrested 20 years ago. You haven't done anything, you've done nothing to raise any questions, you've done nothing to raise any suspicions, and it was fairly clear that by bestowing the Stalin Prize, second class, on Erdman, he was saying, okay, you're back into things now. This was in 1951. And so that all happened while Erdman was here. So if you figure, when all these famous people are moving into this building in 1950, 1951, and Erdman receives a Stalin Prize, he all of a sudden has status in the society of the time. There is a slight hitch to all of that, however, and that is that unbeknownst to Erdman at the time, his wife was beginning a relationship with another famous person by the name of Leonid. My mind just blanked, I'm sorry. The choreographer, Leonid Lavrovsky. And Lavrovsky lived in a building right across, you probably know this building, it's a huge building right across from the old American Embassy on the Ring Road. I believe the address is 67 Tchaikovsky Street. But the fact of the matter is that Lavrovsky had 3 Stalin Prizes. And I don't know whether that is one of the reasons why Natalia Chitsin found him perhaps in the end of more interest than Nikolai Erdman, I don't know, but this was all happening about the same time because Lavrovsky's 3 Stalin Prizes came starting in the late 40s up through 1950. And so as Erdman was winning his measly single second-class Stalin Prize in 1951, Chitsin might have been looking at him and saying, Kolya's not as great as I once thought he was. I'm going to jump to one thing because I just love this. I think this is a wonderful letter. Erdman wrote wonderful letters. And I'll come back a little bit to their life here in this building. But I want to jump to the end right away. And in the summer of 1953, Erdman wrote to his wife, and he had now found out that she was having an affair with Lavrovsky. This is, as I say, in the summer of 1953. And Erdman writes, forgive me, Natasha. I've translated this into English. He didn't write it in English. Forgive me, Natasha, but I have gotten so old. He was 53 at the time. Forgive me, Natasha, but I have gotten so old and have become so sclerotic that I simply cannot remember the name of your choreographer. It's a shame that for the latest time you have answered everything I tried to ask you with silence, or that you have wrapped your responses in such secrecy that I still have no idea of what your plans and intentions are. Whatever they may be, I would be in despair were I inadvertently to force you to change them in any way. I will leave Moscow at the end of August or in early September. I will return shortly in October, and then I will leave again. Then he writes a little bit about newsy stuff about friends and family, and he finishes the letter, "Sleep soundly, my sweet, and if I am correct in my assumptions that you prefer to live apart, do live at home," meaning this place right here. "Don't forget that we lived together for 12 years and we parted in 5 minutes. You can't make sense of everything in 5 minutes. I kiss you, Nikolai. Answer me, please." Her answer was, "Yes, I do want to live apart." And in one of the more scandalous, deliciously scandalous events of those years, I'm guessing, Lavrovsky traded apartments with Erdman. Lavrovsky gave Erdman his apartment across from the American Embassy. Erdman moved there, and Lavrovsky moved into this building here. The apartment that Chidzen and Erdman occupied was apartment number 9 on the 6th floor. If you look from Mamonsky Pereulik, from this side of the street, you can look up and you can see the windows. And as I said, I spent some time in there. I interviewed Chidzen a couple of times, and a couple of times I just went to visit her. I can't say that we became friends, but we became friendly. And it was interesting because, you know, she had split from Erdman in 1953. And then when perestroika happened and all of the changes started to happen in the 1990s, I shouldn't say everybody, but lots of us came to Russia interested in Nikolae Erdman. There was a woman from Germany, Andrea Gotzis. Andrea, if you happen to be watching, hello. There were other people doing research on Erdman at the time. And everybody, because Erdman was no longer around, many of the people that Erdman had lived with and worked with were no longer living. People descended upon poor Natasha Chidzen, who had spent 12 years with Erdman, yes, but in the 1940s and early 50s, and this was the 1990s. I mean, she had forgotten about Erdman completely by this time. She had no interest in Nikolae Erdman, and I must say that my impression was always that she really never understood who Nikolae Erdman was. She didn't know anything about the suicide or the mandate. She did know that he'd had some play done by Meyerhold back in the 20s, but she really didn't know anything about it. She knew nothing about the suicide, and she couldn't have because the suicide had been banned and nobody had ever seen or heard it here in this country. Only very, very elite writers would get hold of copies and read it. They read it. Writers knew it, but not beyond writers. Film directors would know it. And she knew him as this guy that wrote these film scripts. You know, he wrote scripts for cartoons and he wrote scripts for other films, but she really didn't understand who she'd been living with. And she was a little bit taken aback when everybody was descended upon her and wanted to hear her stories, and she really didn't remember much. So she would always start by saying, you know, I really can't tell you much because this was a long time ago, and when he left my life, I basically forgot about him. And one of the reasons, Nikolae Erdman liked his cognac. He was not a vodka drinker like most Russian writers are. He was a cognac drinker because he wasn't entirely Russian. As I said, his father was of German heritage, so he was half German. And he enjoyed his cognac, and he often would get together with other writers. He and Alesha would get together, Platonov. They would hang out, by the way, down at another building at the other end of this, almost at the other end of Tverskaya, the National Hotel. They would get together and hang out. And they would drink and talk. Nobody knows about what, because nobody ever got a chance to ask them. At least nobody like myself who would have cared to have written it down and remembered it. Anybody else you ask that knew about it would say, I don't remember. I talked to Josef Prut, who was a playwright, a couple of times, and he was a good friend of Erdman's from his childhood. They grew up together, and they used to get in street fights together. But he was at some of those meetings where Alyosha and Platonov and Erdman would hang out. And all he could tell me was, the only thing I can tell you is that they never talked about literature. So beyond that, I can't tell you what they would talk about. But some of his other friends were a little more insistent. He was a very good friend of Alexei Dickey, the actor and director. And Dickey was quite a drinker. The very last time I spent some time in this building would have been 1995, when Natalia Chitsin was still alive. I went to see her to give her a copy of the book that I'd written, based in small part on stuff that she had told me. But she told me that day, as I was leaving actually, I'd come in and we'd just been chatting. And as I was on my way out, we were standing in the entryway to the apartment, and she said, you know, maybe one of the reasons I really don't remember that much about Nikolai is that he really infuriated me sometimes. And his friends would infuriate me because we would be asleep, 3 a.m, and somebody would start banging on the door. And she said, you have to remember, this was in the 1950s. You have to remember, Nikolai had been arrested. Nikolai had been in exile. And when people started banging on your door at 2 or 3 in the morning, it could be very frightening. And I would say to Kolya, don't get up, don't answer the door. And he would usually get up and he would go and he'd answer the door. It would be Alexei Dickey and a couple of other actors who had had too much to drink, and they'd come over to Kolya's because they knew that he had cognac. At least he might not have vodka, but he'd have cognac. So they'd come rolling into the apartment. Of course, Kolya couldn't kick them out. They'd show them in. They'd sit until the morning. And this may be one of the reasons why Chitsin was so happy. I don't know whether Lavrovsky, to whom she went when she left Erdman, I don't know what kind of a drinker he was, but if you can imagine, if you had to put up with that kind of stuff very long, you might in fact find somebody else to replace this guy and tell him to go home or go somewhere, not home, go somewhere else. Another thing I want to mention, because these are small little personal touches, and they're the kinds of things that are the reason I write this blog that actually has given rise now to these talks that I'll be doing here at the theater. That last time I was in the apartment that Erdman had been in, Chitsin once again kind of walked me around, and she showed me the sofa. There was a very old sofa, very old, very kind of hard, flat, but very stately looking sofa, very wide. Not at all the kind of sofa that we see in houses these days. Certainly you would never find anything like it in IKEA. And she told me then, and I hadn't known this, that this was Nikolai's father's sofa. I mean, it was the sofa they had had when Kolya was a little boy growing up. And it came to Kolya when they moved into this apartment. He brought this sofa with him. And that first year that they lived in this building, Nikolai's father, Robert, who I'm going to remind you again, who played a fairly large role in The Jolly Fellows and played a very large role, played a leading role in one of Boris Badenet's films in 1932. He died in this room, in this apartment, on that sofa. And so there is this kind of, you stand there in a room and you're looking for reasons. If you're like myself, I'm Nikolai Erdman's biographer. So I'm looking for reasons. I'm looking for ways to get inside of this story that I'm trying to tell. You're looking for things that can give you a personal connection, that go beyond the dates and go beyond the names. And you stand there and you're looking at this sofa that is really wide and hard and very old and obviously old. And you know that when Kolya was a little kid, he probably had trouble jumping up on it because it was his dad's sofa, probably brought from the Baltic states, and that it came into this place when Erdman moved here in 1950, And then that year when his father died, he was lying on this sofa and he died there. And that's one of those moments where there's a little bit of a connection that happens, you know? And it goes beyond the stuff that people tell you, and it goes beyond all kinds of things. And all of a sudden something happens and you go, I just kind of made connection with this thing that I'm trying to do. But I must say that the biggest one, the one that had the biggest effect on me, and she had never told me this before when I'd been there. She told me just this one time, because about the sofa, she had talked about that from time to time. She says, look at this plant on the windowsill. And there was one of those cactuses that every one of us has. I mean, we all have this cactus. It's that thing where a new thing grows out of the old one and they just grow like crazy. And they're in every single house I've ever been in Russia. We have one. And it was this huge cactus on this windowsill that looks out onto the Stanislavski Theater from the side here, and looks out onto Tuz, the Moscow Young Spectator Theater. And she said, that's Kolya's. She said, that plant was Kolya's. When Kolya came, he came with the sofa and that plant. And if the sofa was cool, but the plant was a living thing, you know? The plant was still alive when I was standing there in 1995, and it had been alive. Nikolai Erdman had watered that plant, of course, you know, and I was standing there looking at the plant, and there were probably cells in that plant that were still, you know, left over from then. I can't say, it doesn't go as far as, you know, like chills down the spine. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite go that far, but I must say that that's one of those moments when I made a connection, when I felt as though I was connected, really connected to the man about whom I was writing, who I'd written by that time, who I'd written a book about. I will say that I actually felt very strong contact with him all the time when I was reading his works. Through his literature, that's where the chills came down the spine. Was sitting up at 3 or 4 in the morning with my then new wife, and she would be reading the stuff to me, and we would be laughing and howling and talking about it and making connections. This incredible writer. That's where the chills came down the spine. But that plant, that cactus plant, I'll never forget the cactus plant. The cactus plant was a very cool thing. Some of the other people, does somebody have a watch or a telephone? I turned my phone off because I didn't want it to ring. Kostya is not here. Ребята, скажите, пожалуйста, сколько времени сейчас? Скажите, сколько времени? It's 10 to 8. Okay, thank you. I just did some writing about Emil Gilils, who also lived here in this building. And I found a couple of interesting things. There was also an interesting personal thing, too. And let me start with the personal thing, a connection to Gilils. It's not a direct connection to Gilils. But Emil Gilils, as you all know, was one of the great musicians of the 20th century, one of the great pianists in the history of the Soviet Union. I didn't know that. I was an American kid. I listened to rock and roll, and I didn't know anything about classical music. I'm talking now about back in 1981, 82, back in there, and I lived in Washington, D.C. And I had been sneaking copies of Nikolai Erdman's The Suicide, which was this band play that we've talked about, right? I'd been sneaking copies of that into a friend of mine who was a theater director in Leningrad. The play of Suicide was still unpublished in the Soviet Union at that time. And my friend Volodya wanted to read it. He'd never been able to find it. He'd never read it. So what I did is I Xeroxed the whole play. And then on the backside of the pages, I would write letters to my friend Volodya. And there would be and so I'd write him a 2-page letter. And so page 1 and 2 of The Suicide would be on the backside, and my letters would be on the first side. And then a week or two later, I would write him another letter of a page or two or three, and little by little, I was sending the suicide to my friend Volodya Firkelman, who lived in Leningrad. And I would get letters back, and he was very careful, but he was letting me know. He says, things are working really well. You know, I've read up to page 40. There was 83 pages in this edition that I had. And then at a certain point, he wrote back and says, the reading has stopped. He said, I haven't been able to get past page 40. And I understood that it had been intercepted, and they had found, and they were not letting the letters through. Well, a couple of days later, a couple of weeks, maybe weeks, months, shortly after, let's put it that way, I worked in a bookstore, and a couple of months later, a man came into the bookstore looking for a map of Moscow. It was a very strange thing to come into a bookstore in Washington, D.C. for. I'm going to make a very long story short because we're talking about the building at 25 Tverskaya Street. But there's a connection with Giliels here, you see. This guy turned out to be a KGB agent who found me because I was sending all of these letters from the bookstore where I worked. So the return address of where I worked was on every single letter I sent. So it was pretty clear how they found where to find me, and they just came looking for me, not looking for a map of the Moscow Metro, of course, although I didn't realize that quite at first. It was when the FBI began contacting me that they explained to me what was going on. This was a crazy time in my life. For 2 years, I had the KGB on one side and the FBI on the other. I must tell you, I don't care really very much for either one of them. But in any case, we were talking one day, I was talking one day to this guy from the KGB agent, and he was telling me about having just accompanied Emil Giliels on a tour. And clearly my face was blank. Emil Giliels didn't mean anything to me. If he'd said Bob Dylan or if he'd said the Rolling Stones, I would have gone, wow, really? You know, I would have done that. But he said Emil Giliels, and I thought, I don't know who Emil Giliels is. And he says, Emil Giliels is one of the great pianists of all time. He said he's my favorite pianist, and I want you to remember that. Actually, I was very good friends with this guy. He was a nice enough guy. We'll talk about him some other time. But that was my very first exposure to Emil Giliels. He was the favorite pianist of the KGB agent who found me in Washington, D.C. because I was sending copies of The Suicide from my place of work at the bookstore in Washington, D.C. to my friend in Leningrad. And when I came to, it was still the Soviet Union when I came here in the late 80s, and I went to find this building where Nikolai Erdman had lived, and on the walls is a plaque that Emil Giliels had lived in this building. I thought, oh no, you can't do this to me. This is way too much. You know, the connections of life and the way that things happen is just a little bit too strange. But anyway, so there's my little story of not connecting me to Emil Giliels, but connecting a person I once knew to him, and a very strange, convoluted connection back to Erdman. And they both come together at this building. Emil Giliels also moved into this building in 1950, and he lived here. He lived here until he died in 1985. But there's a couple of other really interesting connections in terms of years. I talked about the fact that part of the building, the northern part of the building, 2/3 of it, were built in place of a church that had been torn down in 1929. Okay, 1929. Well, Emil Giliels made his very first public appearance as a pianist in 1929. So Emil Giliels was down in his hometown of Odessa, and for his very first time, he walked out on a professional stage and gave his very first performance, 1929, just as part of the building that he would end up living in 20-some years later was actually being prepared because one part was being torn down. One building was being torn down so they could build another part. He won his very first award, Giliels won his very first award as a pianist in 1933. Well, 1933 was the year that they began to widen Tverskaya Street. And of course, by widening Tverskaya Street, they had to go through all of the convolutions that I told you about, which bring us to the building that stands there today. Just a small connection, but an interesting one. He moved into the building in 1950, And in that very year, in 1950, he formed a trio with Leonid Kogan and Mstislav Rostropovich, which is considered one of the great classical trios ever to have existed. The recordings of these three men together are absolute gold. I did a little bit of research. I mean, it's armchair research, but I did do a little bit of armchair research. I found one Western critic who said that he'd probably never heard any three musicians play together better than these three did together. They stayed together almost a decade, and they ended up breaking up. Apparently, at least one of the reasons for it was that Leonid Kogan was a more conservative, politically conservative. Mstislav Rostropovich was more, shall we say, progressive, and Rostropovich and Kogan simply could not get along. So that ended up breaking up the trio. But while Gilios was living here, he was the very first Soviet musician ever to play the Zal Playel, the famous Zal Playel in Paris. It's one of the great concert halls of the world now. As a resident of this street, as a neighbor of ours here at the Stanislavski Electrotheater, Gilios went and performed at Zal Playel in 54. The next year, in 1955, Gilios became the very first Soviet musician ever to tour the United States. He played Carnegie Hall, and he played with the Philadelphia Philharmonic with Eugene Ormandy. But all of that was taking place while he lived here at this building at 25 Tverskaya Street. A couple of other people who I'll just kind of mention a few, and then we can talk. If you have questions about anything, about this topic or anything else, we can pick them up. But as I pointed out, Sergei Lemeshev was one of the great Soviet tenors. In fact, he's considered a lyric tenor. I thought that was interesting. Frankly, I didn't know that as a term, but when I was looking up some information about him, I found that Sergei Lemeshev is considered a lyric tenor. And I asked my wife about him, my wife Oksana Mysina, about him this morning, and she says, "Oh my God," because I told you, if you talked about Bob Dylan or the Rolling Stones, I know a lot. If you talk about classical music, I'm not quite as knowledgeable. And Oksana, I had jotted down a couple of her comments. First of all, she says, "Oh my God, John, you have to know Sergei Lemeshev." That was the first thing she said. Second was, she says, "Oh, of course, he was one of the greatest. Shaliapin, Lemeshev, he was handsome." This is my wife responding immediately to things that are important. He was handsome, blonde, women went crazy over him. He had a very thin, high voice, she said, very emotional. That's another thing that's very important with Oksana. You need to be emotional for Oksana to be interested in you. He was as popular in opera as Leonid Utesov was in jazz, she said. Now, this is not encyclopedia stuff, but this is the reaction of my wife, who is a very cultured person. She's an actress, a very good actress herself. She knows music. She studied at she studied violin at the Gnesin College, and so she knows what she's talking about. So that's her stamp of, Oksana Mysina's stamp of approval on Sergei Lemeshev. While he lived here, by the way, while Lemeshev lived here at this building, he taught at Moscow Conservatory. He debuted as an opera director in 1951, a year after he came here. He staged Traviata in Leningrad. And in 1957, while still living here, he directed Massenet's Werther at the Bolshoi Theater. That was his debut as a director of opera. That all happened here. Alexander Deneka, one of the great Soviet painters and artists, lived here from 1951. He moved in a year late. I don't know what happened, why he was so. Everybody else moved in 1950. He came in 51, and he was here until 1969 when he died. He is known, of course, as a monumental artist. Monstrous paintings of often industrial or military topics, but not only. Some of his most famous paintings were painted while he was here. Fisherman by the Sea in 1956, Military Moscow in 1959, the painting In Sevastopol in 1959. They were all done while he was living here in this building right next to us, which I think is very cool. Another person that I found out just recently who lived here was Maya Plisetskaya, who died a year ago. And I found out about this because somebody saw a blog that I did. I did the blog about Erdman having lived at this building. No, actually, I wrote a blog about Deneka. No, I didn't. It was the Emil Gilils one. It was the Emil Gilils blog just recently. Somebody saw it on the internet, and they wrote me on Facebook and said, my husband was born there and grew up there. He can tell you all kinds of things about this building, and I think I may actually contact this guy and try to get some more information about it. I am now very interested in this building. But among other things, she said one of the people that lived there was Maya Plisetskaya, and I did not know that. There is no plaque there, of course, yet. I would presume that there will be one day, but there is not yet. She only left us about a year ago. But I did find this little tidbit, which connects her to Chidsen, Erdman's second wife, from Plisetskaya's memoirs. And I didn't translate this, so you'll have to pardon me. I'm just going to kind of translate as I go. But she was writing about the other dancers at the Bolshoi Theater. And she said that Galina Ulanova and Olga Lepeshinskaya, of course, two great dancers. You know that. Anybody watching on camera may not know that. So let me say that Galina Ulanova and Olga Lepeshinskaya are two of the great Soviet ballerinas. Galina Ulanova and Olga Lepeshinskaya would get dressed in their very large, spacious dressing room in the baignoire. Aside from them, that room was occupied by Tina Galetskaya, Chidsen, she just says Chidsen, Lyulia Cherkasova, and Yelena Mikhailovna Ilyushenka. Throughout the theater, this dressing room was called the Snake Pit. This is where people went to have evil done, and we'll just leave it at that. So Plisetskaya's attitude towards this dressing room, at least at the Bolshoi, which was occupied in part by Natalia Chidsen, who lived here with Nikolai Erdman, and then later with Leonid Lavrovsky, she was part of what Maya Plisetskaya, in any case, called the Snake Pit at the Bolshoi Theater. Another little, very small connection. I wrote a play a couple of years ago in which Maya Plisetskaya is a character who she's not actually a character in the play, but she is a figure in the play who figures from the beginning all the way through to the end. And when I wrote that play and used Plisetskaya as a figure in the play, I had no idea that she had lived in the building that Nikolai Erdman lived in, where Gilils lived, and all of these things that, once again, seem to connect us. Plisetskaya lived basically towards the end of her life. After 1990, she essentially left Russia. She lived mostly in Germany, but she also lived a little bit in Vilnius, in Lithuania in any case. But she always kept the apartment here, and whenever she would come back to Moscow, she would stay at this apartment here. And she was in apartment number 31. Nikolai Erdman and his wife Natalia Chidsen occupied apartment number 9. So those are a few little details connected with the building at 25 Tverskaya Street. And I would like to have you ask any questions you would have. I hope I'm going to repeat once again that I'm not standing here as an expert. I'm standing here as an interested person. So I do not have a whole bunch of answers about 25 Tverskaya Street, but I'm willing to try to answer any questions if you have any. And if you have questions about anything else, I'd be willing to answer questions about that too. Does anybody have any connection with this? No? I want to point out for people that, once again, this is something you all know and nobody else really does who's watching on camera at this point. But I've talked several times this evening about how Stalin widened Tverskaya Street between 1933 and 1936. And of course, our marvelous mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, now is destroying Tverskaya Street entirely and narrowing it back down. It's sometimes one wonders how decisions are made, why they're made, and one wonders why anyone ever bothers to make a decision when 60 years later somebody's just going to turn it around and do the opposite anyway. So I understand that that Sobyanin's idea is to make the sidewalks very large and to have places for bicycle lanes and to have benches and trees, and one does hope that Tverskaya will look better than it does right now. But I do find it ironic that Stalin ripped this place to shreds in order to widen the street, and Sergei Sobyanin, 70, 85 years later, comes along and he tears everything to shreds in order to narrow the street back down. So there you have a little bit of, that's even a little bit of wisdom. I mean, I haven't come up with anything wise to say tonight, but I think there was a little bit of wisdom in that. You know, things that go around come around. There's a phrase in English like that fits. No questions? Then in that case, then yes, please. Why did I decide to write a book about Erdman? Really good question. Let's try to make this answer as short as possible and as entertaining as possible. The way I tell the story is this. I had just graduated from college. This was in 1980. I graduated from college, the University of California at Irvine. And I graduated with a degree in Russian literature. So, you know, I had this piece of paper called a diploma on which it was written that John Fridman knows everything there is to know about Russian theater because John Fridman has just been issued a baccalaureate award, you know, blah, blah, blah. So there I was, knowing everything there was to know about Russian literature. And I was in Boston at the time, and I pick up the newspaper, and there is a review of this unbelievable new play by this Soviet playwright, Nikolai Erdman. And it says, this guy is one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and his play is one of the masterpieces of the 20th century. And I looked at that review, and I thought, I've never heard of Nikolai Erdman. How could he be so great? Because I know everything there is to know about Russian literature. So I went and I bought myself a ticket to this show, which was in Providence, Rhode Island. It was about an hour's drive from Boston. And I drove down to Providence, Rhode Island. It was the Trinity Square Repertory Company, is the name of the theater. For the people interested in connections, a very good friend of mine is now the artistic director at the Trinity Square Repertory Company, a guy I met in Chicago many years ago. I find this incredible. But went to the Trinity Square Repertory Company, and I sat down front row center to watch this production of The Suicide by Nikolai Erdman, about whom I'd never heard anything, staged by a guy I knew nothing about, Jonas Yarashis. Jonas Yarashis is a fascinating guy in himself. He had staged a version of Macbeth at the Современник Theater in the 70s, around 76, and it had been banned. They shut it down. And he went into exile, and this was one of his first productions after having gone into exile in the West, and he staged The Suicide. And I don't remember ever laughing so hard, you know, for 3 hours. I sat there, and I and the rest of the people in the audience, however many there were, we just howled and howled and howled for 3 hours. And I drove home to Boston feeling, I could sense it. You know, you sense things in your life. Yeah, I drove home with this sense that something in my life had changed. Something was different. I mean, I really did feel that. And the very next day, I went to the library. I mean, I was just working. I was working in a basement in a in a store. I was just a kid. Didn't have any idea what I was going to do with myself. But when I wasn't working in the store, I would go into these libraries and I would look for stuff about Nikolai Erdman. I could find nothing about Nikolai Erdman. There was nothing there. And it so happened I got married and we went to Washington. My first wife worked at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., which meant I was able to get into the stacks. I was able to get back into the library at the Library of Congress, which is like one of the 2 or 3 greatest libraries on planet Earth. And I could just go. Nobody else, you can't just go into the Library of Congress. You have to get a card and you have to order books, and they bring them to you. You don't get to go back and look through the books. Because I had a wife who worked there, was able to get back there. And I would just go down the line, pulling book after book after book out. And I've gotten to the point where now I can pick up a book and I can just flip through it and I will see everywhere where Erdman shows up, because the letter for Erdman is really fat and it sticks out. And I have an eye for it, so I can flip through a book and I can see it. And so I just started, I was just working. In DC, I was working at the bookstore that I talked about. And I just became very interested in this guy. And at a certain point, I thought, somebody has to write about this guy. This guy is incredibly good. And somebody has to write about him. And what you do in life is these things happen to you a couple of times. It happens 3 or 4 or 5 times in your life when you say, somebody has to do that. And you think, well, who could do that? And then all of a sudden you go, oh, I could do that. And so I went back, I enrolled in graduate school in Washington at George Washington University. And I did research on Erdman and wrote a master's thesis. And then I applied to graduate school at Harvard. I went to do my PhD, my doctorate at Harvard, and I wrote my dissertation about Erdman at Harvard. And when I came here to do research for my dissertation, and I met the woman, Oksana Mlysina, who became my second wife, and I stayed, and I wrote the book about Erdman, and I wrote the dissertation, and then I wrote the book about him. So it all started, when I was very stupid and didn't know anything, and I read a review in a newspaper, and I thought, gosh, I have to go see what that's about. That's how it started. Yeah.
So you are living in Moscow partly because of Erdman?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's 2 reasons I live. There's 3 reasons I live in Moscow. There's 3 reasons. One is Leo Tolstoy, the other is Nikolai Erdman, and the other is Oksana Mlysina. There's no other reason for me to be in this city. But those are 3 really big, really good reasons. I read Leo Tolstoy. I read War and Peace when I was in high school, and that changed my life forever. The way my life changed going home after having seen the suicide. My life was changed by War and Peace. I read that book and realized I have to have more of that. I have to have more of that. I read Tolstoy, I read all of Tolstoy, and then I read all of Dostoevsky, and I read all of Gogol, and I read all of Nikolai Chernyshevsky. I read everything, until, again, I thought at a certain point, I have to do something with this. I'm reading these things all the time. For years and years, I spent years reading all these things. I just reading them. And then I decided, well, I have to go do something with that. So I went to school. I enrolled in college, and I got that piece of paper that told me that I know everything there is to know about Russian literature that I mentioned 5 minutes ago. So, yeah. So Tolstoy, Nikolai Erdman, and Oksana Mlysina, the 3 reasons I live in Moscow. Any other questions? Comments? Anybody know any good stories about the building here? Sure, go ahead. The book about Erdman is the only book about him in English. It was the first book about him. The book I wrote was published in 1992, and it was the first book about him. After that, Andrei Gotzis, my colleague from Germany, published what is essentially a book. It's her dissertation, but German dissertations are printed and sold as books too. So it's kind of a combination. Came out about a year or 2 after, no, actually it was 3 or 4 years after mine did. And there have been several books written about him in Russian now, but they're all scholarly books. They're not biographies. They're, analyses of his dramaturgy and his style and that kind of thing. My book is a kind of a general book. It's a book about his literature, about his writing, about his art, but it's also a book about his life. So it essentially is the only book, to this date, it is the only book about him that covers kind of all of those topics. I must say it's a really bad book. It's like anybody, if anybody has written books here, you know that your first one, первый блин комом. I don't know how to say that in English. The first pancake you make always comes out all smushed. Well, it's like that for writers too. Your first book is a mess, and it's the one I love. I mean, I really love it. It's I have one copy. I have one copy left, and it sits there on my shelf, and I love it because it's an incredibly important part of my life. But God, I wish I could do it again. I wish I could do it again with what I know now, and it's too late for me to do it now because so much has come out. So much has happened, so much has been written, so much has been discovered that for me to go back and write a book about him, I have to go back and just redo the whole thing again, and I can't do that. I'm in a whole different place now. So it's my book about Erdman, which is called Silence's Roar, The Life and Drama of Nikolai Erdman, is a marvelous part of my life. I love it. It's one of the great successes and great failures of my life, all in one. And maybe that's the way things happen too. There's a really bizarre, to my knowledge, all of the copies have been sold. The publisher doesn't have any anymore. There's copies out there in places. If you go on Amazon and try to find it, you can find copies for anywhere between $100 and $500. I don't know who in the hell these people are. I never received a penny for the book. The publisher never paid me anything. And Mosaic Press Canada, by the way, if you're watching, you guys never paid me, and you never even sent me the author's copies. I had to buy copies to get copies. I went on the net about a year ago and found 4 copies for $12 a piece, and I quickly bought them. So if you go on the internet from time to time, depending on what used bookstore gets some in, somebody may sell them for cheap, and then somebody else who thinks that it's a really rare book and doesn't really know what they're talking about, they'll try to, charge you $150 for it. I don't know what that's all about. It has nothing to do with me, of course. But so there are copies out there, but hard to find. There's a copy. I donated a copy to the theater library here. There is a copy here at the theater library. Yeah, and I also donated a copy to the Meyerhold Museum on Brusov Lane, Brusov Переулок. So there's 2 copies in Moscow. Well, there's one in my house. There's one at the theater library here. There's one at the Meyerhold Museum. And I think that's it. So there's 3 in Moscow. A Holy Trinity. Certainly, please do. Yes, I did see it. The question was about a production of The Suicide at the Yermolova Theater, which is here on Tverskaya Street. It's just down at the very beginning, right next to the Kremlin, actually. For those if anybody's watching still on Howl Round, the Kremlin is in that direction, and then that's the other direction away from the Kremlin. So that's why I pointed in that direction, talking about the Yermolova Theater. Yes, and it's an interesting thing that they did that show there because did you know that Meyerhold, he was supposed to take over his theater that's up on Mayakovsky Square now. The place that's the Tchaikovsky Concert Hall? The Tchaikovsky Concert Hall was supposed to be Meyerhold's theater. They began building it for him, but he was arrested and murdered before they got very far. And they turned it into the Tchaikovsky Concert Hall. But when he was still working, and he was waiting for that to be built, they put him in what is now the Yermolova Theater. So Erdman would have gone there to see some of Meyerhold's productions at the theater that we now call the Yermolova Theater. So Erdman would have been there, and Meyerhold worked at that theater for a couple of years. And so there's a nice little connection that they would do the Suicide there, because that was a show that Meyerhold very much wanted to do. It's a very kind of a very kind of modern attempt. It's an attempt to be very modern. It's cut down. Of course, anybody who does the Suicide now has to cut it down. It's a very long play. I mean, it's like Shakespeare. You can't do all. You can't do. If you're going to produce them, you have to cut it down. So it's slightly cut down, and it's. I'd like to say it was much better than what I'm actually going to end up saying, because it's not. The show didn't really come out all that great. It's a little bit kind of flat and empty. They tried to kind of skip over it really quickly. Skip over the text, and they swallowed a lot of the lines, and they buried a lot, and so the play really doesn't quite play there. It's very nice to look at. It's pleasant to look at. They did very nice design, but the tragedy and the comedy, and this play is a tragicomedy. If you're not crying and laughing at the same time when you watch the Suicide, it's not being done right, because you have to be laughing and crying at the same time. And there, at the Yermolova Theater, I don't remember feeling any sense of tragedy at all. There's a bit of comedy and irony and kind of, hip coolness kind of going around, but it doesn't really get into the depths. And this is a play that really goes very deep and gets very dark and tragic. I will say, since you ask about contemporary productions, if nobody has seen it, if you're interested, I believe that Sergei Zhenovach's production at the Studio of Theatrical Art is a really good production. It's a very hard play to do, very, very hard play to do. And Sergei Zhenovach I think he did a really good job. I will say this, that I was absolutely stunned by the ending. I mean, he really pulled out the tragedy at the end, and he puts the tragedy on the audience. And I don't want to give that away. Well, who cares if I give it away? The play ends, how does the Suicide ends as a character off stage kills himself. A character who has been talked about throughout the play, a little bit like Maya Plisetskaya in my play. I never thought about that connection. A character has been talked about throughout the play, and he ends up killing himself. And that's what people have wanted. The people of the play of the Suicide want this worker, this unemployed worker who is the main character, Semyon Podsikalnikov. They want him to kill himself and say, I'm doing it for writers. I'm doing it for commerce. I'm doing it for this. Everybody wants him to kill himself and leave a note saying he did it for them, to bring them publicity. And so these people are working on getting lots of people to kill themselves. It's one of the darker sides of the play, that if you don't back up and don't think about that, it just sounds like a funny play. But this is a play about a group of people trying to get all kinds of people to kill themselves. Excuse me. Well, they succeed with this one guy off stage, Fedya Petunin. Fedya Petunin is this guy off stage that the writer, Viktor Viktorovich, has been working on throughout the whole play to get him primed and get him ready to kill himself. And when everybody thinks that Podsikalnikov killed himself, the main character, but he actually just got drunk. He got drunk and he fell down dead drunk, and he got dragged into his wife's house, and they put him in the casket, and everybody thinks he's dead. And he thinks he killed himself, and all the people that wanted everybody to kill themselves, they're all very happy until he stands up and says, I'm not dead, and everybody runs back. Oh, this is terrible, this is terrible. You said you were going to kill yourself, you didn't do it. And so you get this wonderful, incredible monologue that Erdman wrote for Podsikalnikov, in which he is saying, I have not done anything. Why do you want me to kill myself? What do you people do? I have not done anything. I am absolutely pure as driven snow. He doesn't say that, I just made that up. But, it's this beautiful monologue in which a man talks about his own purity and his own innocence. At that point, the news comes in, and Zhenovach has it come in through the hall. the writer, the character, Viktor Viktorovich, comes in through the hall and announces to people on the stage and to people in the audience that I have great news because Fedya Petunin has just shot himself. And the character, Erdman's character, who has just had this beautiful monologue about how innocent he is. And he instantly becomes implicated in the death of this Petunin guy, because if he had done something to try to stop this, Petunin maybe wouldn't have shot himself. If he had stood up to these people, had said, 5 days ago, what the hell are you doing with me? Leave me alone. There's no reason for me to kill myself. Stop, don't do this. But he didn't do that. He went along with it. He went along with it. He went along with it. He went along with it until Fedya Petunin killed himself. And it comes out, in essence, that Podsikalnikov, the main character, is the guy who is, to a large extent, is to blame for Fedya Petunin having killed himself, because he did nothing to stop it when he could have. He understood what was going on. He knew what was going on. Did nothing. He said nothing to anyone. And it was I will say this, when I saw the premiere of that show, it was 2 or 3 days after the murder of Boris Nemtsov. And the notion of not standing up and not talking, and look what happens when you don't stand up and don't say anything, hit that audience really hard that night in the theater, believe me. It was very, very, very powerful. I don't know how it reads now, but with the murder of Nemtsov still very, very clear in all of our minds and hearts, that came like, it hit like a hammer. And so highly recommend that production, Sergei Zhinovacha's production, the Studio of Theatrical Art. Yeah. Is that it? Good? No questions? You came in almost in time to hear something. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming. Bye-bye now.